lie, but the evidence to date, I think, suggests that all or a substantial part of these positives could be due to what's called false positive tests. Now, government knows that the PCR test is very sensitive, and all tests have a propensity to throw up a particular false positive rate. But what's really frustrating, Julie, and your listeners should know this, the government either doesn't know what the false positive rate is, or if it does, it's not declaring it and continuing with the assumption that it's zero, and it's definitely not zero. And Carl Hennigan did a calculation, and he showed that if the false positive rate is as little as 0.1%, then more than half the positive tests are in fact false or fake. And I think the false positive rate is probably much higher, possibly 1%. And if that's true, most or all of the positives are actually false, and they're not infected, infectious or ill.
And the key thing there is, of course, I mean, again, for those of us who are not medically trained or scientifically trained, or indeed a great mathematicians either, it's because the actual percentage of people who are being tested positive is a tiny, tiny percentage. So if you have a false positive rate at that level, you actually are accounting for effectively all of the positive test results. And this comes down to how they're testing and how they carry out these cycles to sort of try and get particles of a virus. And as far as I can understand it seems to be along the lines of the fact that we are finding traces of the old virus, basically dead virus that's been caught 6 months ago, that could not possibly make the person ill currently and could not possibly be infectious to other people, in which case we're finding 3,991 cases of people, largely of people who may or may not have had the virus in the past or don't have the virus at all, in which case not much to worry about.
Yes, I do think just a couple of things. So you're absolutely right. We know that, because it's been shown, that people who've recovered from the virus and they're clinically well, and you can no longer culture virus from a sample from their mouth or airways, still can be positive in the PCR test. And that's because, as you say, positive in the PCR test. And that's because, as you say, the test is not a test for virus. It's not a test for living virus. The test looks for a particular piece of the genetic code, and if it finds a small piece of a dead virus that's still stuck in your mucus and is being shed from cells, you could still be positive on a swab test for a long time. So that's what I think is a significant contribution. And the other one is just intrinsically that tests occasionally, statistically, throw up false positives. And as you say, a very good point, Julia, that the ONS survey still says that the prevalence of the virus is very low, which is good, less than 0.1%. So if we find 2% positives and yet no one's ill, I'm worried that specifically Matt Hancock's Pillar 2 test is flawed.
That's community testing. That's people who are going to school, going to work and getting tested. Yeah.
Yes. And I think, did you see on the TV the other day, they showed a little clip of people beavering away on a line of white tables, looked like big picnic tables, and they were in something that, for all the world, looked like a marquee tent. Mm-hmm. And there were some, people casting around, wearing gloves and so on. I think if they're really doing the tests or processing the samples there, you've got to be kidding. Imagine this was a test in a forensic case in law, because this is the same kind of thing. They use PCR to try and prove you are or are not the guilty party. But if you were doing your forensic work in a tent like that, the lawyer would just throw it out and say, don't believe it.
Right, that's